everyone. I'm Ethan Duvall. Today I'll be presenting the project Frozen Pi for Virginia Tech's System and Software Security course. This project is a modern take on cold boot attacks targeting embedded systems. Specifically, we'll be walking through how I recovered AES keys from a Raspberry Pi 4 using a custom memory dumping attack. Here's a quick overview of where we're going. We'll start with the history and motivation behind cold boot attacks. Then I'll walk you through the technical architecture and how I built the entire attack pipeline. Finally, we'll cover results, what was recovered, defenses, and key takeaways. This is structured into 3 thematic sections. When memory won't forget, how does it all work, and resurrecting the key. Imagine writing a message in invisible ink, something that is meant to disappear, but before it could finish disappearing, an adversary took it and put it in the freezer and stopped it from disappearing, allowing them to access info that they shouldn't have. That's what cold boot attacks are about. Data that's supposed to vanish from RAM but doesn't. In this first section, we will look at why cold boot attacks matter, where they came from, and why a Raspberry Pi might be holding onto more than we think. Let's go back to 2008. Researchers at Princeton showed that RAM, dynamic memory, doesn't just forget everything the moment you cut power. In fact, if cooled, the data can linger for seconds to even minutes. They demonstrated that you could retrieve sensitive material like encryption keys and even pictures of Mona Lisa, if that's what was there, from RAM using a simple cold reboot and a bootable OS. The original attack involved freezing RAM sticks, quickly transferring them to a second system, and reading them. And it worked, bypassing things like full disk encryption. But back then, RAM was, well, it's still now, RAM is removable in these systems. BIOS settings were accessible, and attackers had more direct, or in this case, attackers had more direct hardware access. That brings us to the question that sparked this entire project here. Can we recover data that shouldn't exist anymore? More specifically, if we cut power on a Raspberry Pi, could we retrieve sensitive data like AES keys from RAM after reboot? Would that key survive long enough, and how would we even extract it given the Pi's constraints? This is what this Frozen Pi project is set out to explore. So what is a cold boot? A cold boot means powering off a system fully and then turning it back on, or starting a system from a fully off state. This can be done by just pulling the plug on a device or running commands that bypass the graceful shutdown procedure. When you do this, DRAM doesn't instantly forget. If the conditions are right, attackers can actually reboot into their own OS on a system and scan for leftover secrets that are still floating in memory. The Raspberry Pi poses some unique challenges. Its DRAM is soldered directly to the board, as you can see in the image there on the right. So this means that you can't just transplant the memory like in a traditional cold boot attack. There's also no BIOS, which means you can't pause boot or run diagnostics before the OS starts. And quite often, Raspberry Pis are used headlessly, so we have to really do everything programmatically. Next, I will break down all the scripts that I designed to answer the questions that we posed earlier and to get around the issues that the Raspberry Pi poses. The attack starts by planting a known AES key into RAM. The whole script statically defines a 16-byte key and copies it repeatedly into a 16 megabyte array. We touch every page to ensure it gets allocated into physical memory. The key here acts as our acts as our beacon, something we can search for after reboot to see if memory has persisted. As you can see at the bottom, we have sleep 120. The script here runs for 2 minutes, ensuring that we have enough time to obtain the PID and the virtual start address that it provides and move them over to the virtual to physical translator, which I'll go over next, to be used in the dump script or the targeted dump script. So here's the virtual to physical translation script. We need to know where the actual key that we're storing is, and the virtual memory doesn't really help. So with virtual to physical, reads from the proc, then whatever your PID is, page map, to convert the actual process's memory region into physical addresses. It then saves those to boot/keyrange.txt so that when the system reboots, the dump script knows exactly where to look. Without this, at least for the dump, the targeted dump, dev/mem access is mostly guesswork. So the dump script reads a targeted memory range from dev/mem using the physical address that we calculated before using the virtual to physical. It writes this to a .bin file on the SD card. This version is mainly used for controlled testing. It's fast, narrow, and efficient. We use this to validate that our key is actually sticking around in the RAM after reboot. This is the dump full script. This is something that you would see in a more real world attack scenario. You wouldn't know where the key is. So we created this dump full, which scans the entire RAM space. It dumps from around 0x1, 7 zeros after, and then to F8 with 6 zeros after, skipping any pages that are unreadable between those two addresses. It writes this result to boot, similar to the dump script. This file gives us a complete memory snapshot post-reboot, which we can then analyze offline. It's slower, but more realistic. Just to mention before we get into the demo, I mostly used SCP to offload any of the scripts, as testing and pulling the SD card out over and over again caused some hiccups, and I had to run the script every time, which takes quite a long time, especially for the full dump. So as an overview of what the attack looks like end to end, it runs the hold key to place our key into memory. It then uses virtual to physical to get the physical address. We then pull the plug on the Raspberry Pi after spraying it with canned air to prolong memory retention. On reboot, rc.local automatically runs dump full or dump, depending on if you're testing or trying to actually pull the whole RAM. We retrieve the dump file, SCP as mentioned before, and then analyze it. In a real world scenario, you'd likely just shut the Pi down and then pull the SD card off and then analyze it offsite. So here's our injecting our test key. As it's not a random test, injecting the known key allows us to measure how much of the memory survived the cold boot. The hold key script repeats the key across 16 megabytes to ensure redundancy and also give us some leeway to actually find the key. This also increases the likelihood that it survives in multiple regions, which helps with recovery and testing. So running this actual test was pretty interesting. It is a little bit odd to see the Raspberry Pi seemingly dripping wet, but the compressed air is non-conductive. Seeing it with frost on it is pretty cool. From the video you saw, we sprayed the DRAM, the black rectangle next to the processor, uh, with compressed air, holding it upside down so that instead of spraying the air, it actually sprays the very cold compressed liquid out. We sprayed it for about 10 seconds. Once this was done, we then unplugged the Pi's ground cable, instantly shutting the system off. As mentioned before, this does not give the Pi a chance to do a graceful shutdown and to clear the RAM and do any of its other protective measures, which it doesn't have many of. It's kind of up to you with the Pi. It just immediately cuts all power running to the system, allowing our boot dump script to work its magic upon reboot. So for the memory dumping strategy, timing is really everything. The RC local script is triggered immediately after boot, before login or services start. So the user can't actually do anything when RC local is running. By saving the dump directly to boot, we can remove the SD card, plug it into a laptop, and begin analysis without needing to touch the Pi again. This strategy gives us the best chance to capture memory that hasn't been overwritten. To start, just as testing, I was actually saving the bins to .tmp, but I found that as I went on, it was more valuable to actually clear it manually instead of having to worry about losing things when I was restarting the device. So let's say you know a valuable flash drive was tossed into a landfill. You've got hours of footage, millions of trash bags, and just one chance to spot this flash drive. Recovering keys from a memory dump is kind of like that. You're wading through gigabytes of random bits, hoping to find a pattern that looks somewhat familiar. In this section, I'll show you how we filtered the noise, analyzed the dump, and against the odds, actually ended up recovering the key. So what it outputs is just a raw bin file. It's unintelligible for humans. It's just unreadable. So now we've got this 4 gigabyte binary file. What do you actually do with it? So our Python analysis script scans overlapping 16-byte windows across the dump, counts repeated values using collections.counter, filters out printable strings, low entropy chunks, and other filler data. It then also searches for exact or fuzzy matches to our known key using Hamming distance. This pipeline cuts through the noise and highlights likely candidates. In regards to the fuzzy matches, this never ended up actually being used, as I could only either get the program to find the exact match or no matches. It was hard trying to find that middle ground where the key can actually be recovered or the key isn't completely decayed. So for people that wanted to see some of the code that was used to complete the analysis, here you go. This isn't the entirety of the code, but this is pretty much all of the main functions that were used, where it pulls the dump, it calculates entropy, also to check if it's a good candidate, meaning that it's not zeros, it's not printable. Then for the find key candidates, I actually implemented a progress bar. That's just for my own ego to see if I could get it done. Then the main script in here is the search known keys. This takes the candidates, the data, and then the threshold that we've given for it to make sure that it can actually pull data if we were using the fuzzy results. That can be changed if you want it to be more lax or if you want it to be more strict. Yeah. So here are the numbers from two of the runs, one run from the targeted dump and then another run from the full dump. With the targeted dump, 16 megabytes of data took around 10 seconds to scan. The full dump, which was around 3.9 gigabytes, given that all of the memory wasn't actually accessible, took around 30 to 35 or 25 to 35 minutes. In both cases, we successfully recovered our test keys. The keys that you see that we are searching for had different purposes. The all zeros was almost a sanity check to make sure that we were at least receiving something off the DRAM. And then the actual key was just an AES test key. And that's the one that we injected ourselves before reboot to see if it actually persisted over the power cycle, which, as you can see in both cases, whether we're looking at just the 16 megabytes that the key is actually stored in versus looking at the entirety of the RAM that we've offloaded. You'll also notice that the smaller targeted dump on the top says saved 34,659 filtered candidates to candidates.txt. I ended up having to remove this from the full dump analyzing just because the text file was getting to be quite large, writing well over 34 million lines to a text file, while also looking for keys and trying to analyze them, caused some hangups when attempting to actually run the program. So these pie charts show just how noisy the memory can be. Even in a tiny known range, we still ended up discarding around 97% of the memory. That's how noisy RAM is, even seconds after placing the key into it. After dumping nearly 4 gigabytes of data, we flagged about 14% of it that was key-like, which sounds high and is quite a bit higher than the targeted dump, but we still ended up managing to find the candidate using our filtering pipeline, or find our test key, sorry. So the next question here is, how do you protect against this? First, and this may sound a little silly, don't let untrusted users near your device. This is the main thing. Once someone else has physical access to your device, there's really no telling what they can do with it. The full disk encryption is good, but only really helps if the memory is actually cleared. Secure systems would zero memory on shutdown. The Pi really doesn't. You can get it to do it, but baseline it doesn't. And in enterprise setups, you can also trigger RAM clearing through tamper detection or things like kill switches to make sure that if someone is messing with the RAM, then it would kill the system or whatever you actually decide for it to do. So no project is really without limitations. DRAM decay is highly unpredictable. Temperature, your individual chip quality, and the time that the system is off for between reboot or power off and then actual reboot all play a role. On the Pi, we rely on Linux's boot order, as there is no BIOS. We can't delay or pause the system. This attack also assumes physical access, which may or may not be realistic depending on your threat model. Um, Still, the findings are valid. Memory does linger after boot or after shutdown, which is a little scary. So here's what I took away and what I think you should take from this. Cold boot attacks are still extremely viable in embedded systems, even in 2025. RAM isn't instantly cleared on reboot, especially on minimalist devices like the Pi. Um, if you work with encryption or sensitive data, assume your memory can be read unless it's explicitly wiped. This applies to not just hackers, but also to forensics, data recovery, and device hardening. Make sure that if you're trying to delete data, that you're actually deleting it. It'll always leave traces, but there's ways to make it leave less traces. So that wraps up my Frozen Pi project demo. Thank you very much for listening. It was really interesting digging into this seed idea. If you have any questions, feedback, or if you'd like to actually discuss anything, please reach out to me. My email is provided below. Again, thank you for taking the time to listen. I hope you take the time to try something like this yourself.